Hi, good morning to you. I'm Keith Landry. Welcome to Orlando Matters. I hope your weekend is a winner so far. A couple important topics for you this Saturday on Orlando Matters. Going to talk about giving the gift of life, giving blood, and a media competition between one of the most popular radio stations in Central Florida and our sister station, Fox 35. We'll get to that. We're going to talk about affordable housing as well. The need for affordable housing in Central Florida, a big study that looked at that, and what some folks who work this issue every day say we should be doing to fix that problem. So that's what we're looking at. And welcome back to Orlando Matters. Hope your weekend's really well so far. I'm Keith Landry. Continuing our discussion now, we're going to talk about affordable housing in Central Florida. This is a growing concern with many of the community leaders and housing advocates, working folks, teachers, firefighters, police officers, people who serve us on a regular basis, and yet some of them struggle to have an affordable home. So we're going to take a look at that for the rest of the show here. Andrew Nothstine, you're a community planner. I want to thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. The reason why I brought you in is because you did a big, long study on affordable housing.
Correct.
It was an 8-month study. Came up with a 111-page report by the time you're all done with it. And what were your insights on this?
Well, there were a few things I think that sort of surprised me and that I found really fascinating. One of them is that when we're talking about affordable housing, we're not just talking about a housing unit. It's this issue is something that really affects so many other things that are going on in our communities right now. Because when you have high housing costs, you generally don't have families that end up in homelessness. Typically what happens to people who are facing high housing costs are that they have to commute long distances. They have to find a place to live that's 30 miles away from their jobs or 40 miles away from their jobs, or they live in overcrowded conditions. So both of those sort of outcomes have a lot of serious impacts on many of the other kind of issues that we're seeing in our communities, whether it's air pollution and long commutes and congestion and all sorts of things.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on that. What are some of the other things that we look at that get exaggerated?
Well, there's one of the sort of missing components to this discussion, I think, is the transportation cost side. For most families, their top two cost burdens are housing and transportation. And what people are finding now is that when you have societies and communities that are dominated around the automobile, which on average costs a family about $7,000 to $8,000 a year to maintain.
Really?
Yeah, it's a very, very significant cost burden. You end up in a situation where the transportation costs might even be exceeding your housing costs. So we really have to look at these two together. One of the things that we're not talking enough about in this debate is investing in transit and making sure that we have a more efficient transit network so that we can reduce those transportation burdens on a lot of our households.
And the transportation planners have been yelling and screaming about that for 20 years here.
Absolutely.
They're right on the cusp of maybe getting something done, but it's still not done yet.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we're going in the right direction, but we have a lot further to go.
Yeah. What are some of the how badly do we need affordable housing? Did your study identify the need for it?
We didn't look at specific numbers locally necessarily. We kind of looked at it more from a broader global sort of angle. And what we found was essentially, like I said, the need for affordable housing. It used to be talked about as sort of a social or moral obligation that we had to the poor. You know, that everybody deserved an affordable place to live. But now we know that the reason that we need it and the reason that shortages are bad for our communities is the economic development side of it, the remaining economically competitive in the global marketplace. Being able to, as you said in your teaser there, to have a place for our teachers and our police officers to live so that we can remain a kind of viable and dynamic community. So the issue isn't anymore, for most people, isn't anymore about that moral obligation. It's much more about making sure that we tackle this issue for economic development reasons.
And getting back to the economic and perhaps the moral for a second, what does that say when we have teachers that teach our kids and firefighters to keep our home from burning down and police to keep us safe, but yet they can't necessarily afford a decent house for their wife and kid?
Yeah, I think it says that we've done a lot of things poorly over the last several decades. We've made a lot of mistakes. I think the sort of land development patterns that we've seen in Central Florida with very low densities, a lot of sort of suburban sprawl typologies, and this development pattern doesn't serve to allow affordable housing to be generated by the private market, especially when you have a very desirable place to live like we do. When we're building in this sort of development form and we're very desirable, those two things don't fit together to make sure that we can have those people in our communities. So we've done a great disservice, I think, to a lot of those people with our land development regulations and patterns.
I guess I ought to ask you the most basic question. How do we define affordable housing for Central Florida?
Well, it's there's all sorts of technical definitions. It's probably one of the most technically complex issues facing the planning and development community. And generally, what you're looking at, you don't want a household paying more than 30% of their gross pre-tax income on their housing and utilities. That's sort of the generally accepted definition. So that's going to obviously fluctuate based on what your income is. But generally, that's what we're looking at. And affordable housing for somebody who's making $20,000 a year versus affordable housing for somebody who's making $40,000 a year, those are very different issues and very different strategies that we need to come up with to solve those different sort of problems.
Where would we put the affordable housing in the Orlando metro area? Is there a specific place that's zoned for it, or is there a likely place to put it?
Well, there's not necessarily a specific place that's zoned for it. Where it makes the most sense is where there's access to good, efficient transit, because again, there's that transportation component. We need to make sure that if we have light rail come to Central Florida, which a lot of us hope is in the near future, areas around those stations would be perfect places for more affordable housing. And you also want proximity to where the low-income jobs are. So obviously, the core of our low-income jobs are down in the Disney Universal kind of attractions area. So having more affordable options in areas where you have more low-income jobs makes sense, because then we're not dooming those people to long commutes.
What else do you want the public to know that you discovered in your study? Because it was an in-depth study, and there are not a whole lot of studies on affordable housing floating around. So we ought to pick your brain a little bit while we have you here. What did you find?
Sure. I think sort of two of the choices that I think we're going to have to make in our society on this issue. There's all sorts of kind of small-term, easy fixes and little programs and stuff out there, but if we want to really tackle this from the long-term perspective, I think there's two things we really have to do. One of them is redoing our land development codes, really tearing those apart. A lot of our communities here are zoned completely for 1,200 square foot houses, minimum size houses. So we have to look at some of those codes and figure out, what doesn't make sense, what is prohibiting affordable housing from coming to the market, and that's going to be a challenge. And part of that challenge is also going to be accepting density. Densities are going to be a critical part, especially since we're such a highly desirable community. We have to have higher densities in order to be able to achieve more affordable products. And
does that mean you're building the equivalent of townhomes that are right next to each other, or are you building up?
I think both, actually. One of the problems in Central Florida is that our density models are either the high-rises downtown, the 3-story kind of garden-style apartments, or waterfront condos. Those are all the conceptions of density we really have in Florida. But there are a wide number of other sort of densities that we can be achieving. Kind of a more human scale, 5 to 6 story sort of typology has been very successful in a lot of other communities, and is a great way to make sure that we have more affordable housing options and that we have more efficient transportation options as well.
If you had a chance to talk to elected officials or planners of Metro Orlando, the Central Florida area, if they were watching right now, what would you say to them?
Well, I would say that there are no silver bullets on this issue. There are no easy answers. Like I said, it's going to have to take a cultural and political acceptance of density, which in a lot of places we don't have right now. It's going to take some serious commitment to investing in transit, and it's going to take a serious commitment to redoing our land development codes. And all three of those are very, very difficult things politically, and we're just going to have leaders who are willing to step up to the plate and make those difficult decisions, and if we're going to have a long-term impact on the issue, I think that's what we need to do.
A lot of work still ahead of us, it sounds like. All right, well, thanks for sharing the results of your study with us.
Thank you,
I appreciate
very
it
happy to
much.
be here. Appreciate it. Thanks.
It's a lot of insights. We're going to take a quick break. We'll wrap up this discussion regarding affordable housing.